We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable duties, and among these duties are sacrifice, discipline, and the pursuit of virtue. Of course, that's not what the Declaration of Independence says, but we can imagine a counterfactual history in which the Declaration of Independence featured duties rather than rights. So how can we imagine this? Let me try to explain what I mean. The exercise of our rights described in the Declaration of Independence and elaborated in the Constitution, especially the first 10 amendments of the Constitution that we call the Bill of Rights, at least in part, defines our liberties. To what degree our contemporary conception of liberty coincides with the conception of liberty held by the Founding Fathers is another question. And of course, we don't know if the Founding Fathers all shared the same conception of liberty. They disagreed among themselves, both on fundamental principles and on practical application. Investigating the concept of liberty in America from its inception to the present day would be a paradigmatic task for conceptual history. And I don't doubt that in the coming years there will be philosophers of history who will analyze the American Revolution as carefully as Reinhard Koselleck analyzed the French Revolution in Critique and Crisis. I'm not going to attempt this kind of analysis, but instead I'm going to focus on a couple of different conceptions of liberty. What did the Founding Fathers mean by liberty? When John Jay wrote in Federalist Number 2 that, quote, a people descended from the same ancestors, speaking the same language, professing the same religion, attached to the same principles of government, very similar in their manners and customs, have nobly established general liberty and independence, unquote. Or when George Washington warned his brother in a letter that, quote, liberty, when it degenerates into licentiousness, begets confusion and frequently ends in tyranny or some woeful catastrophe, unquote. Or when Jefferson wrote that his fervent prayer to heaven was, quote, spreading the happy influence of reason and liberty over the face of the earth, unquote. Or when Madison wrote in Federalist Number 10, quote, liberty is to faction what air is to fire, an ailment without which it instantly expires, unquote. Did they all mean the same thing by the liberty they invoked? While the language of rights has become pervasive today, we're more likely to talk about freedom than liberty. And this poses the question of whether what we mean by freedom coincides with what the Founding Fathers meant by liberty. In my last newsletter, I wrote about how conceptual oppositions are rarely logical negations. Rights and duties, for example, aren't contradictories. The negation of a right isn't a duty, but a non-right, and the negation of a duty isn't a right, but a non-duty. Far from these being mutually exclusive, rights and duties properly understood are bound to each other as two sides of the same coin. Rights without duties are close to being what George Washington condemned as licentiousness, while duties without rights are close to what Washington called tyranny. I could say that a similar principle holds, mutatis mutandis, about apparent conceptual identity in contradistinction to conceptual opposites, as with the apparent identity of liberty and freedom. In ordinary language, liberty and freedom often mean the same thing, but they aren't logically identical, even if they do overlap in their meaning. What we mean by liberty today was perhaps best expressed by John Stuart Mill, not an American, and not someone writing during the Revolutionary period, but who wrote almost a century later. In his On Liberty of 1859, Mill wrote, quote, the sole end for which mankind are warranted, individually or collectively, in interfering with the liberty of action of any of their number is self-protection. that the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. His own good, either physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant. He cannot rightfully be compelled to do or forbear because it will be better for him to do so, because it will make him happier, because, in the opinion of others, to do so would be wise or even right. These are good reasons for remonstrating with him, or reasoning with him, or persuading him, or entreating him, but not for compelling him, or visiting him with any evil in case he do otherwise. To justify that, the conduct from which it is desired to deter him must be calculated to produce evil to someone else. The only part of the conduct of any one for which he is amenable to society is that which concerns others. In the part which merely concerns himself, his independence is of right absolute. Over himself, over his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign. Unquote. Thus spake John Stuart Mill in On Liberty. This passage I've just quoted is the shortest bit that I could tear from context that still carries what I take to be the essential meaning of the book. Mill wrote in an admirable Victorian prose that's difficult to quote because his sentences are long and his paragraphs are very long indeed. But it's in Mill that we find some of the most eloquent expressions of human freedom and of the sovereignty, autonomy, and dignity of the individual. These are ideals not only of a conception of freedom particularly associated with the Enlightenment, but also perennial ideas of the human spirit, which would probably be recognizable in any age. If we could transport John Stuart Mill back in time and place him in an earlier social milieu, I suspect he would have had much the same to say, even if he said it in a different idiom. I call Mill's exposition of liberty the liberal conception of freedom, and it only fully comes into its own in the modern period in the context of a social and political milieu that is distinctive to the modern period, but is still a perennial idea that we can find in many periods. That the liberal conception of freedom can only be realized in the context of liberal democracy is implied by the fact that both liberal freedom and liberal democracy were both ideals expressed by Mill. He was also the author not only of On Liberty, but also of the book On Representative Government. These parallel ideals of liberal freedom and the individual realized within the liberal democratic society are part of the core of the Enlightenment ideal, which is the implicit, or even if imperfectly realized, foundation of contemporary civilization, which we could also call Enlightenment civilization. What I call the liberal conception of freedom could, with some justification, also be called the Enlightenment conception of freedom. The United States was the first nation state to be explicitly founded on Enlightenment principles, though the founding fathers didn't express their conception of liberty in exactly the way that Mill did. I think it's accurate to say that Mill represents a further development of the Enlightenment ideal that the founders tried to put into practice with the American Republic. In this sense, the liberal conception of freedom was implicit in the founding fathers and in the institutions of the U.S. government. So to a certain extent, we could say that it is part of the founding fathers' conception of liberty. This is the conception of liberty that is, I think, most familiar to us today, especially to those of us in Western nation state, but it's not the only conception of freedom that has functioned as an historical ideal. In contrast to the liberal conception of freedom is what I call the illiberal conception of freedom, which has a much longer history. With the illiberal conception of freedom, we find ourselves in the presence of an ancient idea that's been a touchstone of Western civilization, but a touchstone that's been among the great traditions that the rise of the Enlightenment was at very least, the rise of the Enlightenment has very least occluded when it hasn't actually openly attacked the illiberal conception of freedom. And this is important. It's a crucial point at which the Enlightenment project parts ways with the most ancient sources of the Western tradition. And insofar as the Enlightenment project is the foundation of contemporary civilization, this is one of the points at which the Enlightenment represents a rupture with the past and the origins of a new form of civilization derived from this preemption of the earlier forms of Western civilization. So what exactly do I mean by the illiberal conception of freedom? I found a perfect evocation of it in Isaiah Berlin's essay on Herder, in which Berlin, discussing the Protestant Pietists, writes of, quote, above all their preoccupation with the life of the spirit, which alone liberated men from the bonds of the flesh and nature, unquote. And that's it in a nutshell. The traditional conception of human nature is that it is in slavish bondage to the flesh, to nature, and to the world. It can only be freed from this bondage through the cultivation of the spirit. The Pietists, of which Berlin wrote, were a modern religious faction appealing to an ancient idea. The illiberal conception of freedom is already implicit in Plato's critique of democracy in Book 8 of the Republic. Democracy, according to Plato, in seeking to place personal freedom above and before all else, inevitably degenerates into tyranny because it places demagogues in power who ultimately destroyed the institutions that raised them to high office. Freedom, thus practiced, issues in its opposite. Thucydides' description of the revolution on Corcyra, which is modern Corfu, in his History of the Peloponnesian War, is eerily reminiscent of Plato's more abstract and theoretical account of the collapse of democracy into tyranny. The Platonic critique of democratic freedom is often formulated as a distinction between true freedom and mere license, which are related to each other as reality to mere appearance. It is mere license and not freedom, properly speaking, that is presumably what leads to the ruin of democracies, and which we can compare to George Washington's warning about licentiousness. The illiberal conception of freedom is one of the central themes of Spinoza's Ethics, part 4 of which is titled Of Human Bondage, in which Spinoza seeks to demonstrate that the human will is in bondage to emotion, which in most translations is rendered as affects. Spinoza opens part 4 with a forthright statement of his thesis, quote, human infirmity in moderating and checking the emotions I name bondage. For when a man is a prey to his emotions, he is not his own master, but lies at the mercy of fortune, so much so that he is often compelled, while seeing that which is better for him, to follow that which is worse, unquote. In part 5 of the Ethics, Spinoza attains remarkable heights of eloquence and intellectual nobility in praising the life of the man who can overcome the bondage of his emotional life through the exercise of the intellect. While Spinoza's formulations are thoroughly rationalistic, his message is essentially the same message of his contemporaries, the Pietists, about whom Isaiah Berlin was writing in the passage I quoted earlier, and who expressed these ideas in a spiritual form rather than in a rationalistic form, as Spinoza did. With the advent of the Enlightenment, the idea of a spiritual discipline leading to inner freedom seemed, if not merely quaint, to be actually opposed to true human freedom. Again, we see the contrast of the idea of true freedom to merely apparent freedom, but now it's displaced from the illiberal conception of freedom to the illiberal conception of freedom. David Hume, one of the great representatives of the Enlightenment, ridiculed the traditional forms of spiritual discipline in the Western tradition. He wrote, quote, celibacy, fasting, penance, mortification, self-denial, humility, silence, solitude, and the whole train of monkish virtues. For what reason are they everywhere rejected by men of sense, but because they serve no manner of purpose, neither advance a man's fortune in the world, nor render him a more valuable member of society, neither qualify him for the entertainment of company, nor increase his power of self-enjoyment. We observe, on the contrary, that they cross all these desirable ends, stupefy the understanding, harden the heart, obscure the fancy, and sour the temper, unquote. That's from Hume's An Inquiry Concerning the Principles of Morals. Hume doesn't even attempt to understand the symbolism and the meaning of what he calls the monkish virtues, either in terms of their source in spiritual discipline or in terms of their ideal, which is spiritual freedom. In this way, Hume's philosophy represents in the large the dilemma of Enlightenment historiography. He simply dismisses the monkish virtues as irrelevant or even injurious to the Enlightenment moral standard that he erected to replace them. It's interesting to compare this famous passage from Hume with a remarkably similar passage from Spinoza, also from Part 4 of the Ethics, which I've quoted from earlier. And Spinoza wrote, quote, "It rarely happens that men live in obedience to reason, for things are so ordered among them that they are generally envious and troublesome one to another. Nevertheless, they are scarcely able to lead a solitary life, so that the definition of a man as a social animal has met with general assent. In fact, men do derive from social life much more convenience than injury. Let satirists then laugh their fill at human affairs. Let theologians rail, and let misanthropes praise to their utmost the life of untutored rusticity. Let them heap contempt on men and praises on beasts. When all is said, they will find that men can provide for their wants much more easily by mutual help, and that only by uniting their forces can they escape from the dangers that on every side beset them. Not to say how much more excellent and worthy of our knowledge it is to study the actions of men than the actions of beasts." Unquote. We can see from these two passages that Spinoza and Hume are, at least in some respects, closer to each other than any simplistic contrast between liberal freedom and illiberal freedom would suggest. Spinoza and Hume might find common ground if their shades could be brought together to discuss the question, but the social context of freedom has radically changed, both from that of Spinoza's time and that of Hume's time. While the world that Spinoza knew is almost entirely lost, we can also say that the Enlightenment in Hume's time was not yet what the Enlightenment project has become for us today. Should we regard the illiberal conception of freedom as a relic of traditionalism, of which we are best rid of? Has the world changed too dramatically for the individual today to seek inner spiritual perfection, hence spiritual freedom? Is the illiberal conception of freedom a retreat from the world, an admission of defeat? In other words, is it the motivation for what Gilbert Murray called a failure of nerve? Is it necessary to turn from the world in order to cultivate the life of the spirit, or can one remain engaged with the world while one struggles against the blandishments that enslave the spirit? The illiberal conception of freedom, I think, is no less perennial than the liberal conception, and could well be realized in the milieu of a liberal democratic society, but it would be best realized in the context of a society that understands and values the meaning of the ideals that lie at the center of the illiberal conception of freedom. This would be a society in which the spiritual discipline to attain freedom from the flesh and its appetites is valued above other purposes that an individual might pursue. The ideals of feudalism, as imperfectly realized in actual feudal societies, as the Enlightenment is imperfectly realized in our contemporary society, I say the ideals of feudalism constitute the optimal context in which the illiberal conception of freedom could be realized. The chivalric ideal of the knight as an individual who has achieved perfect martial and spiritual discipline exemplifies the illiberal conception of freedom in a Christian social context. We can find this expressed, for example, in St. Bernard of Clairvaux's short book, In Praise of the New Knighthood. Both traditional feudal societies and modern Enlightenment societies fall short of their ideals, and the individuals who jointly comprise these societies fall short of the ideals of freedom embodied in each. respective social order. That both ideals are imperfectly realized means that there are perversions and corruptions of the illiberal conception of freedom, no less than perversions and corruptions of the liberal conception of freedom. We need to say this because it's the nature of an ideal to contrast that ideal to its conceptual negation, that is to say, to everything that is not the ideal. This idealistic perspective tends to throw together into one basket everything that deviates from the most pure and perfect exemplification of the one or the other. In other words, it's the beginning of a purity spiral. It would be relatively easy then to conflate a perversion or a corruption of the liberal conception of freedom with the illiberal conception of freedom itself, or the perversion or corruption of the illiberal conception of freedom. Principles distinctions are important here and must be observed if we aren't going to lose ourselves into confusion. Minding the distinction among varieties of freedom and their corruptions is important because there are substantive differences as well as commonalities between them. As different as liberal and illiberal conceptions of freedom are, both are conceptions of freedom realized within a social and political context that optimally actualizes them. There are other conceptions of freedom for which this is not the case. Both the liberal and the illiberal conception of freedom are equally opposed to the anarchic conception of freedom, which could also be called the Hobbesian conception of freedom, which is the freedom that obtains in the state of nature, which is a perpetual war of every man against his neighbor. Or, as Hobbes put it, quote, "Whatsoever therefore is consequent to a time of war, where every man is enemy to every man, the same is consequent to the time wherein men live without other security than what their own strength and their own invention shall furnish them withal. In such condition, there is no place for industry, because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently no culture of the earth, no navigation, nor use of the commodities that may be imported by sea, no commodious building, no instruments of moving and removing such things as require much force, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear and the danger of violent death, and the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short," unquote. In the state of nature, there is perfect freedom, but this perfect freedom entails the possibility of being deprived of our own perfect freedom at any moment by the equally perfect freedom of another, who has the freedom to murder us just as we have the freedom to murder him. This Hobbesian conception of freedom holds only outside social and political milieu. And it was so terrifying to Hobbes that he thought everyone had to give away their rights to a sovereign Leviathan that could enforce limits to this perfect freedom in the state of nature. The liberal and illiberal conceptions of freedom hold only within social milieu, and each is best realized in a social milieu that reflects the ideals implicit in the respective conception of freedom. The illiberal and liberal conception of freedom then have some properties in common, and so are not entirely disjoint. The two aren't contradictories, but they are distinct ideals, and as such, they have served as ideals for distinct societies in different periods of human history. From a superficial perspective, the liberal conception of freedom has triumphed in our own time, and that's because the liberal conception of society has triumphed since the Enlightenment. But as the liberal conception of freedom has triumphed, it's trapped us all in the idea of realizing our own authenticity, as in the language of the existentialists, or self-actualization in the language of psychology and psychiatry. But for all the authenticity and self-actualization we've lived through or attempted to realize, the psychoanalysts have also diagnosed a condition that they call the existential void. That an existential void would attend the indulgence of human appetites would not have surprised any of the theorists of the illiberal conception of freedom. Freedom of any kind is not without its costs, but can we transcend the opposition between liberal and illiberal freedom? I think we can, because there remains the possibility that an extraordinary individual might exemplify the ideals both of liberal and illiberal freedom, asserting in action the sovereignty, autonomy, and dignity of the individual in both the liberal and illiberal spheres. Such an individual would not only transcend the social order of Enlightenment civilization, but also the social order of earlier and now defunct civilizations. We don't think of transcending the limitations of a now defunct form of society as a kind of achievement of any kind, but insofar as the illiberal conception of freedom is as perennial as the liberal conception of freedom, a revolutionary change in society can bring us back to a former state of society at virtually any time. And so perennial ideals are never truly defunct, even if the social order in which they served as ideals are well and truly defunct. So what would freedom look like that transcended both liberal and illiberal ideals? Mill wrote that over his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign. The theorist of illiberal freedom would assert that the individual can never be sovereign over his own body and mind until he has achieved the discipline over body and mind that is the ideal of the illiberal conception of freedom. Realization of the ideal of the liberal conception of freedom, then, may be predicated upon a prior realization of the illiberal conception of freedom. If, therefore, the illiberal conception of freedom must be realized first, before the liberal ideal of freedom can be constructed on that basis, we can imagine a society in which spiritual discipline is prized as the way to realize the illiberal ideal of freedom, so as to be able to eventually and later realize the liberal ideal of freedom. In such a society, we might have the kind of variation on the Declaration of Independence with which I began, that puts duty before rights as the proper order by which freedom is to be won. Thanks for listening. I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History, wishing you a happy 4th of July.